Um, Now we're going into our next session of Pride 2020, which is based around plus mental health with Dr. Edrica, Richardson, who is a concierge therapist and relational life. Um, she does a lot of work with pedagogical and therapeutic skills to create a community with her clients. So we think that she's perfect for talking about, the issues that LGBT plus members may face with mental health. We don't talk about a lot, and even less so in our community already marginalized. So you can imagine the difficulties, the emotion, tragedies and traumas that members of the community can face. So that's why we asked Dr. Richardson to come today to really give us some tips, tricks, and ways kind of combating the pervasive issues that we face around mental health silence uh, in the community.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me, and thanks for that introduction. Let me share my screen with you guys so we can get started. So I purposely titled the presentation Privilege, Power, and Pride so that we can really take a look at how all of those things can impact the whole self of the person. As people start to really take a look at their mental health and how in general, if we don't look at our mental health or ways to cope with stress, it can impact us on a daily basis. So what I'm hoping we'll get out of this presentation is that we will take a look at the intersectionality of it all, and I'll explain what that means, how we find meaning in the words we attribute them to, and how the minority stress model affects mental health. And we'll round out by talking about some coping mechanisms, and I will open it up for any questions that may be out there. So when we talk about this idea of intersectionality, it's a word that has made its debut in the late 80s and swept the way through many of sociology, psychology courses across college campuses, and has become one of the buzzwords for anyone dealing with any type of what we call identity politics during the last decade or so. It describes the dynamic of identity that has always been something we've all tried to make sense of. It sums up the conflicting aspects of one's being. And essentially, it's also, on the downside, a gateway to dealing with discrimination, because it helps us make sense of how things like race, class, socioeconomic status, gender, religion, ethnicity, and much, much more can all overlap and affect how others perceive you. So for many people, intersectionality is a very hard concept to grasp. It combines those perceptions with privilege. So you have a recipe for misinterpretation and disaster if we don't understand how each item affects. So some believe that when we actually claim a minority status, their experience within that minority representation is summed up to you should answer for everybody in it. But on the other hand, what it does help do is identify minority groups so that we can try to combat the discrimination and stigma that one can experience. So one could assume that a person who may be, for instance, Black, queer, identified, may have a more difficult experience than a heterosexual white male, just by virtue of the experiences of being a woman, compounded with the experiences of being a Black person. So we understand that the intersectionality could present a harsher life, earning potential, so that we must identify how those things coming together can impact the whole person. So we want to understand that those constructs have an effect on the majority group, as well as they have a greater impact on minority groups, because they can wreak havoc on the individual and can really lead to a lot of stigmatization as well as identity crisis issues, because you're trying to understand how do all these things make up who you are, but also how do all those things impact the things that you may have access to or attribute. So when I first saw this model, I'm sure, hopefully many of you have seen this before, I've always understood that a lot of people confuse the common terminologies like sex and gender. And sex, by classification, is the biological characteristics. So when you're born, the doctor will say to your parents that you have a male child, a female child by sex, or an intersex child, which would be a child with ambiguous or inconsistent biological indicators for them from a visual standpoint. So, but most people, and even most textbooks, and use the word sex and gender interchangeably. And one thing we have to understand is that gender is a dimension that is based on social, cultural, and psychological characteristics. So gender is your psychological sense of those characteristics of masculinity and femininity. So the dimensions of that, because they're impacted by social, cultural, and psychological characteristics, believe it or not, across countries, they mean different things to different people. And so some, as a result, take on certain gender roles. Those would be those actions or beliefs that are culturally associated with masculinity or femininity. Some people even will have certain gender identification based on that. What we want to understand by this is that we don't know what it is until we ask a person what is their identified gender. And that's one of the things when we look at intersectionality that we don't want to identify just by saying that when we look at somebody like people do with race, that we can put or place a gender on them. And so sex and gender could be both and, or it can be something that is either or depending on the person. And because it has fluidity with some of the characteristics, the best thing we can do, especially when interacting with others, is to ask and remain curious, because a lot of the attitudes that we have are based on these cultural misconceptions that have affected how we've interacted and created more of a mental health stigma, especially within the community. And so one of the things we look at is even the letters, right? I say letters have meaning, but the meaning is attributed to really the person. And I say that because we're all familiarized with the LGBTQ acronym because it's made its way into mainstream media. But what has happened as a result of it is that it's widely accepted now based on the first 5 letters. But the Q, depending on who's using it, can stand for different things. We know that the Q can either mean questioning or queer meaning many things. And I found that a lot of people use the term queer because it's not specific to sexual orientation or to gender identity, but it's more of an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of people. It's anything that exists outside of the dominant narrative. And minorities specifically seem to identify with the term in particular because it's also used to convey the nuances between race and culture and how they can interact with a person's gender identity, not just because it's an umbrella term, but because of the connection it has to the queer nation. And so one of the things that we want to ask ourselves is that, what are the meaning we're giving to the letters? And I say that because many individuals who are trying to identify or figure out who they are still looking through the module we have for the letters and trying to figure out how do they make sense of that. And that is important from a psychological standpoint, because when you get a sense of identity and identity confirmation for yourself, then you'll be able to say it, believe it, and live that experience, which gives you a healthier, happier, and more content life based on the research. And so, as we know that there are many additional letters that are added based on the community in which you identify. And I want to encourage everybody to figure out what those letters mean for you, because to each person, we don't want to assume that just because we're even a part of the same community that the letters mean the same thing. But what this has done, though, on the other side of mainstream media, is that these letters have created a higher level of a stress impact from a mental health standpoint. Myers in 2003 looked at the minority stress model, and he identified how stress has impacted the lesbian, gay, and bisexual populations in particular, and the various stresses and coping mechanisms that can add either a positive or negative impact to mental health based on the social impact. Significantly, many of the concepts overlap, representing that there is an interdependency between having a minority status, having some potential mental health concerns, as well as having some individual issues. So the model looks at the experiences of prejudice, expectations of rejection, hiding, concealing, internalized even homophobia, as well as how is the coping process happen. So we've seen that stresses such as homophobia and sexual stigma that may arise from the environment require an individual to adapt. But also it causes significant stress because ultimately it affects your physical and your mental health outcomes. So the underlying concept with minority stress assumes that these stresses are unique. They can also become chronic and socially based. And they're socially based because we know that this theory has also been applied to other minority statuses like women, immigrants, and impoverished racial and ethnic minorities. So there's much room and additional investigation needed. But one of the things we've seen is that there's a strong correlation between this theory and stressors when it comes specifically to improving coping skills when it comes to those who identify as LGBTQIA. So it relies on stress conceptualizations that seem most relevant to minority stress. And it helps us look at how can we support, how can the external social conditions also impact how you perceive, how you cope, how you deal with mental health issues, and how does that impact the structure and the identification for the person. So we know that minority stress is the relationship between your minority status and the dominant values of the culture, and how that can create conflict, how that could create a hazardous or helpful social environment with those groups, and how it can also perpetuate certain stigmas and prejudices that we see exist in the lives of individuals. So this is very important from a mental health standpoint, because we want to make sure what we're doing is that we're always aware of how we are being affected, how we are coping with, or are we willing to get help for those things that may impact us? How can we charge our society to be more mindful of the prejudice and discrimination they're adding to the mental health, especially of any minority group? So when we look at the mental health impact, one of the things that can be ignored is mental health, because we feel we're healthy, right? So mental health is one of the most important parts of this idea, though, of being healthy. It drives much of our day-to-day life. So having a bad mental health day can impact you a lot, including making it harder to get just regular things done, like getting out of bed, taking a shower, and even simply is running an errand or not running that errand. So when we see that the LGBTQ community face these challenges just like everyone else, but they may experience even more hurdles to caring because of the access to mental health resources. This usually is related to issues of prejudices that exist within the social context. So LGBTQ individuals are more likely to experience a mental health illness such as depression or anxiety, and that is correlated a lot with the surrounding stigmas that exist within the community, but also with the impact of society and mental health illness in general. So although LGBTQ+ is absolutely not a mental health illness, many people experience mental health struggles. So some of the research has said that the highest rates of mental health concerns within the community are now seen within the bisexual and transgender communities. Younger members of the communities also struggle with mental concerns because of the resiliency factor, lack of support from their families. One study looked at it, said that the mental health issues within the community are 2.45 times higher than those of straight counterparts. However, these things have been tied to ideas or experiences of shame, fear, discrimination, and adverse and traumatic events that may have happened in the past or throughout their lives. So as many people who identify and are a part of marginalized communities, they find it even harder to find resources available to them. And with a lot of the negative stereotypes that already exist, it makes it even more uncomfortable letting people know how important it is to be a part of or to access mental health resources. So when people openly express this part of themselves as well as express their identification, they can sometimes face a lot of rejection from their peers, from their family members, colleagues, which adds to the feelings of loneliness. And this is when we start to see the increase of depression and anxiety happening. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're leveling the playing field with these health disparities that may exist within the community, and make sure that access to mental health resources is available across the board. I know I've been a part of some initiatives, especially over the last year or two, that have really poured out into our local community, trying to make sure we all have access and group support during these changing times. So I would encourage you at any level, if you see an event happening where you can get some information on what may be happening or how to support or increase your mental health awareness, do it. Because we know that the more you isolate, the more you feel that you're discriminated upon, the more that's going to affect your mental health, create more feelings of shame, fear, and loneliness. And as a result, we tend to also see a higher correlation with the community and issues with substance abuse. And we don't want that to happen. So it also hides sometimes the fact of the experienced violence within the community, and those traumatic effects need to be processed again as another way to support your mental health and give you the appropriate coping skills. So giving support in the way you give it to anybody else is what is needed when it comes to the LGBTQ community. Active listening is a good way to start. So asking how you can help is one of the important ways that you can show respect as well as acceptance through your words and actions, not only supporting yourself, but supporting other members of the community. You want to reflect the person's language about their partners, about their identification. You want to ask them open questions and educate yourself on how to be a good ally, whether you're a part of the community or not. And why I say being a part of the community, because I found that even members who identify with the community, because they're still struggling with their own internal battles of what their identification is, sometimes can even add to the homophobic or even sexist mentality. So Pride is a space where people in the community can connect. It's an opportunity that reduces isolation and increases visibility. It's a very powerful way to see your identity in your community and find support from those around you. It validates that we all belong here and we are all loved. It celebrates the rich history within the LGBTQIA community. It includes both pain and celebration. So feeling connected in this community is linked with positive health and positive mental health mechanisms. So embracing your diversity and being inclusive of all people, ideas, and viewpoints, it's your way of respecting others and respecting yourself. So be open, be curious. Promote fairness and opportunities for all. Be one of the health partners as we strive to increase this awareness every day. So one of the things I want to get every person to check in on is themselves, because for us to increase mental health awareness, one of the things we have to do in eradicating the stigma within the community is ask ourselves, are we okay? And when we're not okay, we have to find ways to cope with not being okay. So I want you to consider the following questions. because we know that learning from the past and focusing on past experiences can be sources of personal strength and can help us learn better strategies for how we cope and how we're resilient in working on ways in the future. So by exploring the answers to the following questions about yourself and your reactions to those challenging life events, you may discover how you can respond effectively to the difficult situations that may come up. So, what kind of events have been most stressful for you in the past? How have those events typically affected you? Have you found it helpful to think of important people in your life when you are distressed? And who are those people? Have you been able to overcome obstacles? If so, how? As you go through this list and ask yourself these questions, you want to identify ways in which you found strengths to counteract any issues you may be facing when it comes to any depression, any anxiety, any trauma aspects, because those are the ways to help you cope with any mental health concerns. So let me give you some tools for ways to build this resiliency and build this personal strength and learning more about yourself. So 10 ways. Make connections. One of the great things about Pride is a way to rebel against the system of dehumanization. So I encourage you, and I thank the members of our local community for putting this on, because we need to eradicate the stigma and create a place that everybody is welcome. So make the connections as the week goes on to figure out who can be your part of your new support system, as well as ways to just interact with others with networking and resources. You want to avoid seeing change as insurmountable problems. Maybe along the way of coming up or understanding your identification, you may have lost some people, but what have you gained? Do you see that as just a deficit, or do you see it as now gaining a team of support members? Accept the change as part of your life and part of living. Make goals. Move towards those goals. What are some small identifiable things that you can do to help yourself or to help you figure out if the question still is out there about your identification? Take some decisive actions in making those next steps. You want to look for opportunities of self-discovery, like events like this or other ways that now have been happening throughout this pandemic to gain more information about yourself. You want to look for ways to nurture a positive environment about yourself and the self-talk. We got to make sure that our self-talk remains positive, because sometimes we are the most hazardous person to ourselves just by the things we say. Small things like, I can't do it, or I'm not a smart person. Those are self-reflective of how you feel and feed into your unconscious mind, which can dampen your mental health. So we want to say more positive things like, I'm happy today. Today is a good day. It may not be a 10, but it's a good day. I feel good about myself and how I feel now. You want to keep things into perspective. Sometimes when we think of things yet to come and the ideas of the future, we create unnecessary anxiety, which seem like those insurmountable problems. And once we keep things in perspective, we feel that there are more attainable goals that we can get to. Maintain a hopeful outlook. Events like this, which help us rebel against the system and help us to humanize individuals, create a place for change, create a place that there's less prejudice and discrimination, and allows us to know that there is a space for opportunity. And when in doubt, always take care of yourself. So what are some things you're doing? And it can never help to, when you feel like the problems are at a place where you need somebody else to reach out and find support, go ahead and find a mental health representative who can help you to deal with some of the trauma, deal with some of the pain, as well as help you come to a place that you feel comfortable with whatever you identify. So thank you guys, and a little bit of information to share about how we can increase our power, increase our privilege, and become more resilient in understanding the humanization of it all. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Pride Bahamas and Dr. Richardson. I guess I would like to thank you for your very thorough presentation. I mean, you really touched on a lot of, very vital topics to the community, representation, about introspection, about knowing yourself as a person, and a very, mental things sometimes that really, are the foundation of good and strong mental health. So I just have a few quick questions before I open up to the floor for wider questions. What do you think are some of the ways of combating, I guess, some of the negative ways, or particular negative ways in which members try to cope with the trauma of living in a homophobic society? Ways such as maybe risky sexual behaviors, potentially drug use, or even alcohol abuse, those kind of things, and how they affect the community. How do you think we can maybe begin to combat those kind of issues?
I think one of the first things is doing what we're doing now, which is having events where we bring light to talk about it and get the information out there about the stigma and discrimination that the community experiences, as well as find places that the community come together to find support in each other. Because one of the things that has happened, like you mentioned, is there's been an increase in substance use because of the rejection, because there's a lot of shame and rejection that has been created by the social stigma. So I think that the more we talk about it, the more we make it mainstream, that we have to deal with it. We can no longer just assume or act as if it isn't something that we as a society in the Bahamas need to discuss and make a place for at the table of how we're gonna help combat any type of stigma and discrimination.
Yeah, thank you. That's definitely very true. It's about making spaces in the community for the community, and I think, like in the Bahamas, we have, you know, LGBTQ community has seen sometimes maybe silent or invisible, but the ways in which we are very in, intricate with being society, we're in business of power, we're in business of education, business of cultural and social creation, where we are just as vital as any other community to the country, and
Mhm.
it's very difficult to imagine you know a world where we can sometimes say move beyond these kind of structures strictures and structures that kind of isolate the community, or stereotype the community rather, as being unproductive, unnecessary,
Or other,
and
just being other, that creates an
yeah,
issue.
exactly. And I think it was also vital is that we began to see how the community is in some ways responsible for its own liberation,
Yes.
because so prior to 2020, one of our core ideals was this idea of decolonization and about creating visibility. And I think sometimes people see visibility as being, open, where people can, I guess, use stereotypical ideas to identify as a member of the community. But visibility, as you say, is about, it begins with the self first. It begins internally, and then it moves into first someone's, I guess, their personal relationships, and then their wider community relationships. Like first your family, your friends, your loved ones, and then it moves into your workspaces or those kind of things. And it may necessarily where you may have to say, oh, I am X, Y, Z, or name yourself, but by putting up certain, I guess, kind of ideals in your own mind, you know, having this kind of mental visibility for yourself is what allows people to, begin to feel more comfortable in their skin.
It allows them to feel free. And so even if you don't want to let others know what that is, because I understand sometimes you have to be private with whatever your identification is, you should be able to say it to yourself and feel confident in that. And that's where it first starts, with feeling comfortable, as well as combating your own stigma, because sometimes the stigma starts with us. The stigma starts with the inability to even vocalize to ourselves how we feel and who we are. That's it. The question is, who are we? And you have to be able, on a personal level, always to answer that question for yourself, even if you don't let anybody else know.
Exactly, that's very true, and to bring it back to the personal again, people sometimes don't talk about their religious aspect of their life or their spirituality, and that affects their ideas around sexuality and gender representation, and how sometimes that can be a barrier, to self-acceptance. When you think about, especially, in a conservative evangelical society, so it's where the church, where Christian ideology is very, used as a instead of as a bridge, as a hammer, to bash and to defame and to say, if you do this, you're going to hell, or if you do this, you can't be a member of this church, a member of this family. It's like that danger of being cut off from your own community.
Right.
It'd be so.
And it's unfortunate that religion has been weaponized and used in a way to dehumanize and to isolate members. And it really begs the question to religious group, religious leaders, to religious folk as to, if your message is one of hope and community, why would you isolate anybody from that if that is the root of it?
That's very true, and it's about, if having a stronger community is about making sure everyone feels included and connected and, and important, then it becomes incumbent on, these communities, when they talk about things like violence,
Yes.
or, about broken homes, about, people with mental and other issues. They need to see how sometimes their own ideologies inflict this trauma and create these cycles of oppression and death and, and pain that can only be undone, I guess, by a reevaluation of certain, ideals and ideologies.
And I'll say this before we wrap up. One of the things that every person should do, whether they're part of this community or supportive of the community, is really question some of those ideals that you've learned and how do they make sense and how do they fit into your lives. Because what it usually starts with is that prejudice and discrimination comes from a lack of knowledge. And most people have those things because they've never even questioned those value systems that were given or passed down from generations to generations. All they know is this is what it is. And if you are following those unknowingly, you are on a certain level of ignorance that you really need to correct for yourself and create a better space of openness, curiosity, because those value systems may have been wrong.
That's very true. And, it brings back to the idea of cognitive dissonance itself and how that's a danger fraud process for a person and for a community. On a personal level, it's hard to have these two seemingly competing ideas. And then when you have it on a social level,
Right.
so you have uprisings, you have chaos, you have, this kind of like, this state of just uncomfortableness that can either turn out well or turn out worse than it was before.
Yeah.
But I think it's about not being afraid of that process and having a community of people in your life who can actually guide you through that.
Right.
And I think that's vital for everyone. So before we end, I just want to open the floor for questions. If anyone whether they get in contact with you or they want to ask something, this is the time to do it. So the floor is open now for questions. Okay, so I say they would have any questions in the audience. So again, I thank you, Dr. Richardson, for coming out.
Thank you guys for having me. And I want to say continue because this is a great event as we have to change our country into being more humanized. Yeah. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Have a good afternoon, everyone. And we'll have another session coming up after this with HIV and AIDS. And we'll send the link out shortly with Dr. Morgan. Thank you.